I was thinking about the world building aspect because when you think back to Howard, it's inevitable to some degree that there's a world building aspect to this, and that's part of its appeal, certainly. But for Howard, I'm going to show up a prop here. Here's a Howard story from Weird Tales. I don't think that the world building aspect was predominant in what he was writing. And I'll go so far as to say with Charles Saunders Morrow's stories, he certainly built a very complex and enviable alternative world here, with his alternative Africa in these stories. But it's complex and rich as a background because it adds so much to the characters and what they're involved with. When you get to the aspect of when we're talking about dialogue and character interaction, Howard had plenty of that kind of stuff. Go back and look at the repartee that he has with some of his characters, and the emotion comes through. Everything you want in dialogue comes through. This is absolutely true of Charles Saunders. I think it's absolutely true of what I write, and it's true of what Joe writes. So at that point, you have to try to take sword and sorcery into a direction where it hasn't been before. It can examine new areas, but it should still retain this very visceral appeal. When it comes to world building and this visceral appeal, I think it may be that what game players are getting when they're playing these games, whether it's on the World Wide Web or whatever aspect it is, that visceral kick that we would get from fiction, fiction from a generation or two ago, the sword and sorcery, westerns, film noir, the visceral kick with that comes with also an intellectual quotient where you're appreciating what the writer is doing. Perhaps it goes so far as appreciating the use of language. You talked about Jaquet in this regard, his extraordinary use of language. And you mentioned he's Canadian. There's another writer that Steve Tompkins mentioned in a recent blog on Rehoop, and I've forgotten his name, but he's writing novels that Steve Tompkins likes, and he too is a Canadian. Perhaps there's some literary quotient there that is starting to happen with the Canadian Renaissance that hasn't happened here in America yet. I don't know. I get into hot water if I talk this way because I dropped out of this some years ago, and a bunch of us kind of moved on. But our concern here, if we're sitting here, is to talk about what can make sword and sorcery a viable genre, as much as we'll be able to do that. Do you have any?
Well, you mentioned world building, and I recently had a publisher, an editor, like a story I wrote, and what he never talked about the characters, the dialogue, how the characters interacted, what happened to the characters, the twist at the end. The thing he didn't like was that the world I built, or was attempting to build, didn't jump out and grab him. And I was wondering, well, what should I have had when one of my characters enters the city and there's the guard at the gate? Should the guard have 2 heads or 3 heads? Should there be all kinds of different species? Should I make it like the Star Wars bar? Should I make it outlandish? Should I have motor vehicles and dragons cohabitating, coexisting? And then the other comment was that the magical element to the story was just it was a matter-of-fact overlay to the story. And that was done intentionally. To me, that was like saying I wrote a modern-day story. I wrote a modern-day story, a spy story or something, and my use of the internet in the story as a plot device was matter of fact. Well, in the world I build, which owes probably a lot more to Raymond Chandler and Fritz Lieber, with a little bit of Howard, than anybody else, if these characters are living with the knowledge that there are people that could summon demons like that, and there are wizards and witches and whatever, wouldn't it be kind of just matter of fact that you encounter this stuff every day? I see an airplane in the sky, it doesn't blow me away. So I wanted that. The story wasn't about the magic, it wasn't about the MacGuffin. The story was about the character, his financial predicament, and how every time he tries to touch, almost like, King Midas in reverse. And it seems that a lot of stories, I pick up a lot of fantasy in the bookstores, and I, go through it looking for something to read. And, there's probably a ton of good stuff out there, but there happens to be 5 tons of stuff out there. So you've got to go through a lot to find the stuff that is either, for me, is really good. And a lot of it seems like it's all the same, except that there's a concentration on world building. No disrespect to Robert Jordan, I love the first few Wheel of Time books, but to me it seemed like it might be the publisher's fault too. They kept wanting him to build a world and never end it, never get to the conclusion of the story, just build a world. I like Jaquet because, except for his Icelandic saga, or not his Icelandic saga, his, I can't think of the title now, it was 2 books. His first books were a trilogy, then he wrote a bunch of books, Tigana and The Lions of El Rasar. These books are all set in the same world, but they're individual novels. And then he came out with a duology, just 2 books, which Stephen R. Donaldson also did. But to me, they are advancing, they've taken sword and sorcery and advanced it more into heroic fantasy. Donaldson almost took the woman's romance, the Harlequin romance novel, and turned it into, the Mirror of Her Dreams and The Man Rides Through, which those 2 books I prefer to the Lord Fowl series, which I've also liked. And a thing that Jaquet does with this alternate world history, David did back in the early 80s, I think it was.
82, 83.
82, 83 would Fall the First World, his trilogy, which David moved away from sword and sorcery, or moved it into another area where, what happened with Kandar and Kothar, and why didn't John Jakes do a Brack novel with the scope and the depth of North and South? Is it the market, the fans, or the publishers that are saying, no, let's keep it short and sweet and simple. We want sword and sorcery. If there's going to be sword and sorcery, it's 150 pages. You got 3 characters and very little dialogue. Well, a lot of that is hard to reread because as you get older and your tastes change, you want some interaction between characters. You want them to jump off the page. That's why Lovecraft, some of it's hard to reread because there is no human drama. There is no element. There is no character conflict.
You want that as you mature.
And as someone who has tried to adapt stuff into screenplays or has attempted to write screenplays and had written a few, adapting Lovecraft is a challenge because there's really no protagonist, no antagonist. It's one person against these great forces. Stuart Gordon did it best, I thought, with Reanimator, but he turned that whole thing.
It's turned upside down.
He turned it on its head.
Be appalled.
Now, Jake was talking about the Dungeons and Dragons. I did read the first trilogy or 2 with the Dragons of Winter, Twilight, and I think those were the first ones that came out. And I can only remember it was Margaret something and Tracy.
Margaret Weiss, Tracy Hickman.
Right, and those.
Wow.
And I think they're still writing.
Yep.
And those were good because they moved it into getting some characterization going, getting you involved in these characters' lives and dramas. And there's so much out there that may do it, and there's so much out there that may not do it. We're just trying to figure out why the simple sword and sorcery pulp fiction died. Raymond Chandler and Dashiell Hammett and others are having resurgence. I've just bought some books from the 30s and the 40s that are being republished. Why not all this other stuff? Is the audience out there or not?